Hello, everyone. My name's Chris Paton, and I'm going to talk to you today about human-centered design for digital health. So, just a bit about me as background. So, I'm a medical doctor. I trained in the UK, and I've worked in the NHS and in the New Zealand Health Service. And I'm currently a digital health researcher. So, I work in the Nuffield Department of Medicine, and I'm a fellow of Reuben College at Oxford. But I'm also a clinical senior lecturer for the Department of Information Science at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And if you want to get in touch, I'm on Twitter. My Twitter address is there, and also LinkedIn. And I'll give you my email at the end of the talk. So you've been hearing all about digital health, and my area of research is really around digital health in low and middle income countries. So systems like OpenMRS and Barmny and DHIS2, these are kind of large-scale, open-source digital health systems that are used in clinics and in hospitals, but also by governments for monitoring various healthcare issues at a national level. And you can see in recent years on this graph how the adoption of these types of systems has been growing, and also there's been huge adoption of mobile health applications and applications for smartphones used by both patients and clinicians in low middle income countries. But you've probably also been hearing about how there are some significant challenges now that, especially in high income settings like the UK and the US and Europe, digital health systems like electronic health record systems have been widely adopted, but there's still problems with things like usability and overloading clinicians with too much work to do on the digital systems, and they're not really at the same state of usability as they could be when you look at other types of apps and things that people use on a day-to-day basis. And there's been lots of articles in the press over the last few years and in the scientific literature about how the digital health systems are contributing to burnout. So the question really is, how can we design better digital health systems? And what I'm going to talk to you about today is how we can use human-centered design, which is a method of designing systems so that they're more usable for end users. And one of the kind of founders of the human-centered design kind of movement is a person called Don Norman. And he got started many years ago looking at, as part of the team investigating the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in the US. And they looked at the causes of the accident and tried to work out how we can design systems so that they're safer and more usable. And he ended up working at Apple, working on special projects, and now does a lot of research into how we can design digital systems to make sure that they're safe and effective. And he says that human-centered design really is a process that ensures that designs match the needs and capabilities of the people whom they are intended. And I think that's quite a good kind of definition. There's also a definition from ISO, so the International Standards Organization. So human-centered design is really the standard process for designing information systems nowadays. And ISO is the International Standards Organization that defines standards on a whole wide range of things, but including how we should design user interfaces so that they're safe and effective. And they have a definition that says human-centered design is an approach to interactive system development that focuses specifically on making systems usable. And it's a multidisciplinary activity that incorporates human factors and ergonomics knowledge and techniques. So human factors and ergonomics is about how human beings interact with things, and you might have heard of ergonomics in terms of ergonomic computer keyboards and ergonomic chairs and that kind of thing. And really this is the same idea but applied to digital systems. So one of the original companies involved in human-centered design is called IDEO, and they I think they came up with the first Apple mouse, but have been involved in many different kind of consumer products over the years. And they have this process of doing human-centered design called design thinking. And this is quite a nice way of thinking about how you go through a process of making sure that your systems that you're developing are going to work for the end users. And they have this kind of 3-stage process, which is kind of broken down into further stages, but the first stage is to understand what the problem is and who the end users are. Then to explore ideas, so you don't come up with a kind of a definite idea, you just kind of take an exploratory approach to ideas. And then you materialize something, and then you test it and go back. So they've got these kind of stages of empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, implement. And you can see at each stage you can go backwards to previous stages. So if your prototype's not working very well with your end users, then you can go back and ideate again, or you can go all the way back and re-empathize with who the end users are going to be and what they're going to be needing. There's also a nice approach to this called the double diamond, which comes from the UK's Design Council. And this again is a bit like the same kind of idea as design thinking really, but it says before you kind of decide what you're going to do, you have to kind of explore the kind of landscape of ideas to make sure that you're not going too fast down the process and kind of getting too firm an idea before you actually start testing it and things. So the idea is there's these two diamonds. So the first diamond is to kind of work out what the specific problem is. So you have a general problem, the kind of area that you're interested in, and you do research in all sorts of different ways of looking at that problem, but then you come down to what is the core real specific problem that you want to address. And then again you expand out and you kind of come up with lots of ideas about how you can try and solve that problem. And then you come down to by prototyping to a specific solution to that problem. And there's been quite a lot written about this kind of overall process, and it's called lots of different names, and there's lots of different kind of ways of thinking about it. But the books that we've used in our projects to help guide us are these three. So there's first one is called Lean UX, and UX stands for user experience. So it's the experience that the person using your system has when they're using it. And lean is a concept that's borrowed from manufacturing industry, but quite commonly applied in healthcare and in IT systems nowadays, where you're trying to reduce waste and make things as efficient as possible and using data to try and improve the process. So Lean UX has got some good ideas, and I'll talk a bit about those in a minute. Then there's also Scrum, and Scrum is based on the agile principles of software development. So this is where you do lots of kind of short sprints of work and you iterate rapidly so that whatever you're designing you can quickly change it and come back to meet the needs of your end users, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then finally Lean Startup. So Lean is the same, referring to the same lean manufacturing idea, but applying it for kind of startup companies. And even if you're not developing a company, if you've got a project, it's still quite useful, and talks about how you can do these cycles of learning about what you're building and rapidly iterating to come up with a product that's going to meet your needs of your end users. So just taking those one by one. So Lean UX talks about things like user personas and user stories, and how you can evaluate them to try and improve what you're doing. And I'll talk a bit about that in the context of one of our projects. So this is LIFE. It stands for Life Saving Instruction for Emergencies, and it's a mobile app that we've developed to train healthcare workers in Kenya and other low and middle income countries on how to manage emergencies. And this was our first scenario. So this is teaching healthcare workers, nurses and junior doctors and medical students how to manage an emergency where a baby is born and they're not breathing. So what are the steps that you need to take to try and resuscitate the baby? And we used a 3D game engine to do this, and the users can go through a scenario and they're asked questions, and they decide how they're going to manage to resuscitate the baby. We also developed a virtual reality version of this. So this is using virtual reality headset, and you go into a virtual world. You can actually walk around using the headset, and again learning the steps on how to resuscitate a newborn baby who's born and is not breathing, and using questions and helping the end user decide what they need to do by picking up bits of equipment and things like that. So I'll use this as a kind of example of how we thought about human-centered design in this process. So you come at the project with quite a lot of technology in place that is available to you, like smartphones and things like that. But then you can go through a process of developing user personas and user stories, kind of from the lean UX process, and then taking a kind of agile approach to software development. So we release new versions of the software frequently to try and, if we discover things in the data, or if we're talking to end users, we discover problems, we can rapidly iterate. So the first thing that lean UX talks about is personas. And these are quite commonly, it's not just lean UX, it's used quite commonly in all types of human-centered design processes. And personas are basically examples of your end users that might be interacting with your products. And human-centered design also is not just about the end users, but there's another term called user-centered design, which is definitely about end users. But human-centered design kind of tries to say that there's other people as well who might not be actually using the system, but might be impacted for it. And in healthcare, that might be patients, for example. So if you're developing a system for doctors that they use in their clinic, the doctor is the user of the system, but the person impacted might be patients. So you might want to have personas about patients as well as doctors to make sure that you're thinking about them and how they're going to be impacted by the technology. So anyway, so personas are kind of example end users. So rather than using a specific real end user, you kind of come up with these kind of fictional end users that have similar problems to a range of users or a range of types of users. And there's various ways of doing it, but this is quite a nice one that's kind of a downloadable template that you can use when you're doing it. And you kind of draw a picture of the end user, kind of a rough sketch of them, give them a name, an age, occupation, that kind of thing. Write a little bio about their background and what they do, and then think about how the type of thing that you're going to develop could be solving problems that they might have. So you do things like say what their goals are in their work, what their particular pain points they might have when they're doing tasks in their work, and thinking about how your product can help address those pain points. And then you do a thing of user story mapping. So this is really taking stories of how they could use particular features of your system and how they're going to use those in their work or in the tasks that they've got to accomplish, and how your system can help them do that. And we do this through a workshopping process, and you can see on this picture you've got kind of sticky notes on the background. So the designers and developers can then refer to these user stories as they're developing the system to make sure that what they're doing is really meeting the needs of the end users. And this is kind of a close-up of what a kind of board might look like when you've been doing user story mapping. So the idea is that you might have different features of your system. So in our case, it's things like having for the Life app, it might be having being able to answer questions as you go through a scenario. It might be that there's a 3D navigation feature or interaction that you might do. It might be that you can log your scores if you're being scored on a scenario, and another feature might be submitting it for continuous professional development accreditation. And so for each of these, you'd have a user story about how they would use the app to achieve their kind of goals and solve their pain points, that kind of thing. And you split it into several different releases. And the idea here is the first release should be really just the most basic implementation of all of the key features that you want. But at the first level that you can start testing with real users, and they call this a minimal viable product. So the idea is it's the minimal version, but it's still viable, still will do all of the things that you want it to do. And then you can iterate and test that, and each new release you can add on user stories to kind of better do the feature, and you can redo what you've done to try and improve it. So it's kind of, instead of getting a whole fully fledged kind of version, you do the minimal version you can, so you can rapidly change it. And so this is some photos of that kind of process that we went through. So we brought over to Oxford some clinicians, so paediatricians and nurses, people who would be using an app. And really the kind of basis for what we were doing was, how can we use smartphones and new technologies to try and expand out how we do education, particularly for managing emergencies in children. And so we did develop these kind of personas and user stories, and stuck up sticky notes on the wall in this kind of interactive process. So just that minimal viable product, really. There's a kind of infographic by a person called Fred Vorhorst, and he kind of says that a minimal viable product shouldn't be, if you're developing a car, your minimal viable product isn't a wheel of the car, because that's not really showing you what, if you had just people interacting with a wheel and trying out a wheel, it wouldn't really show you, much about what it's going to, how you should develop your car. And also the same kind of thing with a scooter or a bike or a motorbike. This isn't really the same thing that you're building, so it's not really a minimal viable version of what you're doing. What you really want to do is do the most basic car you can think of. So it might be a car even without an engine, that's just sitting there, that you can open the doors and get in, and you can get user feedback from a very early stage on what kind of things that they want, and then you gradually over your releases build up the kind of features to make it more and more like the end product, but you're kind of evolving using feedback from users as you go. One quite useful tool for doing this is wireframing. So you can actually build a kind of very early prototype just using wireframing. There's some software called Balsamiq that's been designed for doing this, but you can also do it just using pieces of paper. And then you can also get the end users, so your kind of group that you're kind of working with, to do their own wireframes and come up with their own ideas about what they might need. And that's quite a nice way of kind of eliciting ideas out of your end users. But with Balsamiq, it can kind of make it a bit interactive. So it's not like a proper app, but if they click on certain buttons, you can tell it to go to other screens, and they can enter in text and things like that. So quite a nice way of prototyping out systems. So Scrum is the other method that we use kind of as part of the human-centered design process. So this is based on the Agile Manifesto. So the Agile Manifesto is basically a group got together, I think in the 90s or 2000s, to say, with the changes in how software can be released, so we can release much more. You don't go to a shop and buy a box anymore for software. You can download it from the internet, and you can have it kind of updated in the background on your phone. So because of that kind of thing, we can be much more agile in how software is developed and change things quickly, and just do little bits of kind of feature development and then release it without doing a whole new version of the app. And Scrum is a methodology for applying those principles. And this is kind of from the kind of Scrum website. This is kind of how they kind of see the whole kind of Scrum process. So you start with a product backlog, which might be these kind of features that you identified through your user story process, user story mapping. So you might have bits of things that you want to develop, and you might have your sticky notes on your board with all of these things. And then you plan a sprint. So a sprint's like a 1 or 2 week, maybe 3 week kind of sprint of software development. And so you take some of your items from your backlog, and you make a sprint backlog, which is kind of a subset of that. And then you work on that for a short period of time. Every day you might have a stand-up meeting where you kind of get together, have a 15-minute discussion about what you're working on. And you might have a Scrum Master who might be able to help with various problems people are having. And then you, after the end of the 2 weeks, you have a review of the sprint, and you check off all the items that you've got on your backlog, and you might need to add new items to the backlog. But really the idea is to increment regularly after each sprint, so you kind of come up with a slightly newer version of your product that's not completely different, but just adding extra things. And the lean UX idea, the lean startup idea, is that you build in metrics so that you can monitor and see how people are responding to the changes that you've made, and then you can actually undo them without undoing months and months of work. You're only undoing a few weeks of work. So lean startup is this idea of build, measure and learn. So you create a new version of your app, you measure using analytics and interviews and things like that, and then you learn to plan new features and updates to correct any issues and meet the customer needs. And this is kind of what that cycle might look like. So you might build doing your programming, release to end users, and then measure data on how people complete tasks within the app. And you can even include things like surveys and things to find out how satisfied they are. And then you use that data to learn about your app and plan how you're going to change things, and then you go into this kind of build again. So one of the ways, and going back to the kind of origins of human-centered design, we want to measure how people are using the app. So how usable is the app? And there's an approach to usability testing that's defined in that ISO standard that is very widely used in software development, and it breaks it down into three kind of categories. So the first category is efficiency. So that's how long does it take someone to complete a task in your app or software. Next is effectiveness, and that's whether or not you can complete a task without making errors. So you kind of get a percentage of tasks that have been completed without making errors. And then user satisfaction. So how do their users feel when they're using the app? And you can measure satisfaction in lots of different ways. But a kind of common way is to do a short survey, which you can include in your app, or just take a sample of users and ask them to complete a survey. But you can also do it through focus groups and interviews and things like that. Another way of kind of applying usability testing is with predictive models. So this same kind of idea of efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction, but using models, scientific models, as a way of predicting that, as opposed to testing on end users. And then you can test and validate whether people adhere to those models. And there's a range of models that you can use that should predict the kind of usability of your system based on how you've laid out the user interface and designed the features. And it just helps reduce the amount of time it takes to develop things if you know that you've designed something in a way that has far too many clicks or far too many options on a menu, or the buttons that you've designed are too small to be able to find easily, that kind of thing. The other way of doing usability analysis is through heuristics. So heuristics is a quite a strange word to use in this kind of context, but really is a rule of thumb. So usability heuristics are usability kind of rules that have been developed by experts over the years. And one of the most widely adopted is the Nielsen heuristics. So Jacob Nielsen, who's a usability expert, and he works with Don Norman, who's the person I introduced a while ago, as part of the Nielsen Norman Group, which is a usability consultancy and education company. And so the usability heuristics are things like the system should be aesthetically pleasing. It should have what they call visibility of system status. So if you're, for example, that might be if you're downloading something, you should be able to see how far through the process of downloading you are, and the fact that it's still downloading. So if you click on something and the screen just goes blank for 10 minutes, you don't know if it's downloading or how far you are through the process. So this idea of visibility of system status is telling you what's going on. And then things like match between the system and the real world. So instead of introducing lots of jargon, and this is kind of a problem with digital health systems quite often, that they have their own way of describing what they're doing, as opposed to using the same language that users might use. And also things like making things appear in the kind of order that you would do them in the real world, as opposed to creating a new set of tasks that wouldn't be how you would like to do things, but is just more convenient for the programmers or the way the software has been developed. So we have kind of applied these processes to testing the Life project, and we went out and we tested a lot with end users. We tested with nurses in Oxford, at Oxford Brookes, but also went to hospitals in Kenya, and we tried both the phone app out with people, you can see that on the right hand side, and also our VR system. We set that up and had people trying that out and giving us feedback to help us kind of iterate. And we followed these we still do this now, keep doing these kind of sprints with releasing and then checking with end users for feedback on how we're doing with things. So that's all I wanted to say about human-centered design, really, and we found it really useful for developing our Life project, and we're also using it for looking at other projects now as well. And if you've got any questions, do feel free to email me. So my email address is chrispaton@ndm.ox.ac.uk, and I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn if you want to connect. Okay, thank you very much.